Hi, Miss Nikki here. We're going to finish up with part 3 of chapter 17, endocrine glands. You can see here we have an image of the adrenal gland looking at the adrenal cortex, which is the outer ring, and the adrenal medulla, which is the inner. So we're going to look at these different layers. You can see that they use the term zona, right? So these are layers within the adrenal cortex. So you can see all of the cortex is here, and there's 1 layer, 2 layers, 3 layers. So we're going to talk about 3 different categories of hormones and then give an example of each one. And then here we have the adrenal medulla, and we're going to talk about 2 hormones that are released from the adrenal medulla. And this would be what we think of as adrenaline. So let's get into it. Hopefully we remember where the adrenal glands are. So these are located on the top or superior surface of the kidneys. These are retroperitoneal, if you remember the visceral and parietal peritoneum. So these sit behind those serous membrane layers. We're going to have some fat and we're going to have some fascia keeping those adrenal glands on top of the kidneys. So you can see adrenal medulla. This is the middle section. So the inner core. And we're going to see epinephrine and norepinephrine. You're going to see me abbreviate these so that I don't have to write them out. So if you see epinephrine and norepinephrine, I'm going to abbreviate them. Here we have the cortex, and so this is going to be the outer region. And there are lots of corticosteroids that are synthesized by the adrenal cortex. We're just going to focus on a few of them. So these are steroid hormones, and then we just saw those zones or layers, and I'm going to go through each one and tell you the major group and then the one hormone that we're going to focus on. Here's a slide showing the major term, like the overall umbrella. So mineral corticoids is one group, and that comes out of that top zone, so that zona glomerulosa at the top. And specifically, the one mineral corticoid that we're going to focus on is aldosterone. The second group is called glucocorticoids, and the hormone that we're going to focus on is going to be cortisol. This is in the zona fasciculata, so then there were these cells that kind of form this ribbon. And then the third zone or layer, we're going to look at gonadocorticoids, and these are going to produce androgens. And androgens is another kind of umbrella term. From androgens, you can convert into estrogen or testosterone. So the sex hormones that we're going to talk about in lab, estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone, can be converted from this kind of base androgen. Here we have kind of an image, just going back and making sure that we understand CRH from the hypothalamus is going to trigger the anterior pituitary to release ACTH, and ACTH is going to go to the adrenal cortex, and it's going to cause it to release several hormones. So this image is talking about cortisol. We'll get there in a second. The first one is aldosterone. Then we're going to look at cortisol, and then we're going to look at those androgens or those gonadocorticoids. I'm just going to write and abbreviate there because I'm running out of room. So this first one that we're focused on here, this mineral corticoid that's released from the adrenal cortex, is going to help regulate electrolytes. So primarily we're talking about sodium and potassium here. So remember that sodium is important, that it is on the outside of muscles, right, as well as nerves, and that it is responsible for setting up that resting membrane potential. So there's a direct effect with sodium levels and water and blood pressure. So they're talking here about blood volume, blood pressure. Remember, we have to have sodium on the outside, and we have to have potassium on the inside to set up that resting membrane potential before we can have contraction or nervous cell transmission. So the reason that this is important and how it ties into blood volume and blood pressure is that if sodium is reabsorbed by the kidneys, water will also be reabsorbed by the kidneys. And if you have increased water, you're going to have increased blood volume, and that's going to cause increased blood pressure. So we'll talk more about this in Unit 2 when we talk about the cardiovascular system, but this is kind of a good first step. Wherever sodium goes, water is going to follow. And you can see down here, they're going to start talking about potassium. If you remember the sodium-potassium pump from muscles, they move the opposite way. It's the same principle here. So if I am reabsorbing sodium and I'm reabsorbing water, what has to be released in my urine? Potassium. So sodium and potassium are moving opposite, and sodium and water are moving the same way. So what's the effect or action of aldosterone release from the adrenal cortex? Basically, aldosterone is going to tell your kidneys that you need to reabsorb sodium and you need to reabsorb water. It's also going to stimulate your kidneys to release potassium because it's all interconnected. And we'll talk about these transporters when we get to the urinary system. So this is a really important hormone because there's going to be lots of drugs that kind of interact. So think of something like a diuretic. If you're taking a diuretic because your blood pressure is too high, you're going to be releasing lots of sodium, you're going to be releasing lots of water, you're also going to be keeping a lot of potassium, right? So you have to kind of monitor some of these drugs that you're taking. You have to monitor different electrolyte levels within the blood. So this will become important when you start talking about pharmacology and drug clearances and kidney function and things like that. But bottom line, could you tell me that if aldosterone is on, if your adrenal cortex is secreting aldosterone, it's going to cause your kidneys to reabsorb sodium, reabsorb water, and increase the excretion or elimination of potassium. What happens if you have hypersecretion? So you have too much aldosterone. This is going to cause hypertension. It's going to cause edema, which is swelling, right? So imagine if you are constantly telling your kidneys to reabsorb sodium and water. If you're constantly reabsorbing sodium and water, even when you don't need it, that's going to cause an increase in blood volume. That's going to cause an increase in blood pressure. So that's where we get the hypertension from. We're also going to get swelling because we have increased water reabsorption, and some of that's going to get stuck in your interstitial fluid. So you're going to see some swelling. In this case, if you're always reabsorbing sodium, always reabsorbing water, you're also always going to be excreting potassium. And this is going to lend itself to having some sort of abnormal resting membrane potential, having non-responsive neurons and muscle action. The umbrella category next up is glucocorticoids, and you can see the word glucose in there. The hormone that we're going to focus on is cortisol. So glucocorticoid cortisol is released from the adrenal cortex in that zona fasciculata, so that middle kind of section. Again, they're showing you what's the kind of chain of events, right? So you're going to see the hypothalamus is going to release CRH. It's going to go to the anterior pituitary, tell it to release ACTH. It's going to go to the adrenal cortex, specifically that zona fasciculata area or those cells, and it's going to stimulate them to release cortisol. So cortisol has a lot of functions here, and we're going to move to the next slide. But you can see it's going to talk to the liver, it's going to talk to lipids, fat storage, right? It's going to talk to all cells. So if you're automatically thinking about the liver, and down here we can see some terms we're going to come back and talk about, but the liver stores glucose. So we're going to see kind of increased glucose, increased lipids or fats. We're going to see something to do all of this with energy, right? So hopefully we can go back to cellular respiration from 201. We know that if we take glucose and oxygen during cellular respiration, we're going to turn that into carbon dioxide and water and ATP, which is energy. So somehow cortisol is going to help increase our energy production or increase the nutrients with which to produce ATP. So the effects of cortisol we can see here. It's going to target the cells to increase blood nutrients. So when we talk about blood nutrients, hopefully we're thinking about glucose, we're thinking about fats, and we may be thinking about proteins. So cortisol is going to bind the liver cell and tell it to do glycogenolysis. So if you remember, glycogen, if it's broken down, it'll produce individual glucoses, and that'll help drive ATP production, right, through cellular respiration. You can also take fat cells and do lipolysis, so break down fats and release them into the blood. You can also take proteins, break them down into amino acids, and use those amino acids to make glucose from non-carbohydrate sources. So that's what gluconeogenesis, new glucose creation. So you're not using any sort of glucose or carbohydrate source, even complex carbohydrate source, to like starch, to make glucose. Instead, you're using proteins, you're breaking them down to amino acids, you're reshuffling those chemical bonds, and you're creating glucose from a non-carbohydrate source. So cortisol, if you want to think about increasing blood nutrient levels, if you want to think specifically about blood glucose, that's fine. So this hormone is basically increasing the fuel that you need, right? So then here, we're talking about energy. What's the critical thinking? Why do we need lots of energy if we're under stress? So sometimes we think of the physical, like someone's attacking us, right? Well, why would you need to have lots of energy? Well, you've got to fuel every muscle contraction. So skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, smooth muscle in your blood vessels to pump your blood faster, right? So all of the point of cortisol is to increase these blood nutrient levels, specifically glucose, in order for all of your muscles and nerve transmission to work more effectively to get you out of whatever situation is causing the stress. They want to plant a seed right here about the fact that we use glucose in the brain exclusively. So the brain wants glucose, and it's the major fuel source. It does not want to use fats or other types of fuel to drive nervous cell transmission. So we'll talk again about this when we get to reproduction. There's something interesting that happens. On this clinical slide, we're looking at hyper and hyposecretion. Basically, if I have increased levels of cortisol, that's going to inhibit inflammation or depress our immune system. Think of it as if I'm trying to survive, if I need my heart to be beating faster and I need my brain to be functioning, I need lots of glucose in my bloodstream to make all this energy to drive all of these functions to survive. I don't really care about my immune system, right? I'm not worried about fighting infection. So if you have increased cortisol, you're going to have increased glucose, and it's going to inhibit your inflammation response and depress the immune system. If you have hyposecretion, so you don't have enough cortisol, you're going to see a decrease in glucose in the bloodstream. That's going to cause fatigue and weakness. But what's interesting is hyposecretion of cortisol in Addison's disease also affects mineralocorticoids, which is aldosterone. So it's kind of a double whammy. Oops, I kind of left some letters off there. There we go. So in Addison's disease, there's a decrease in cortisol, there's a decrease in aldosterone. So the decrease in aldosterone, you see the decrease in sodium. That means you're also going to see a decrease in water. So that's going to lead you to hypertension or low blood pressure. So just kind of some things to think about. If you know how the hormone works, you know what's going to be wrong if you have too much or too little of that particular hormone. The third group that we're going to talk about are gonadocorticoids. So hopefully you're thinking gonads. You're thinking ovaries and testes. So gonadocorticoids are going to release androgens. Androgens can be converted into testosterone, which is the male hormone, or estrogen, which is the female hormone. You're also going to see me lump in progesterone here. So the adrenal cortex is triggered by ACTH to release androgens. Those androgens are going to cause reproductive organs to grow, right? So reproductive tissue is going to grow. That'll trigger the onset of puberty and then the appearance of these secondary sexual characteristics. So breasts in females, certain patterns of hair growth in males, deepening of the voice. they want to make clear that everyone is releasing some of these androgens from their adrenal cortex all the time, unless there's some issue, right? So kind of this bottom part, they're saying, in the textbook they'll talk a little bit more about it, but they're talking about how testosterone released from the adrenal cortex may have something to do with increased or decreased sex drive in women. That once women go through menopause, so they're after menopause, postmenopausal, your ovaries are no longer producing hormones like estrogen and progesterone. So what's your source of estrogen? It comes from the adrenal cortex. What happens if you have too much? So I kind of wanted to just mention that if you have a hypersecretion, so I'm talking about androgens from adrenal cortex. If you have too much androgens being secreted from the adrenal cortex, you're going to have, in young males, secondary sexual characteristics that develop prematurely. Imagine you're a 4 or 5-year-old and all of a sudden you have tons of androgen. You're going to see these secondary sexual characteristics develop. In females, if they have too much androgen, you could see like beard development, which would be more of a masculine because they have too much androgen. Some of it's not being converted to estrogen. They could have an enlarged clitoris because the tissue that makes the clitoris is the same is the same tissue from the penis. So if testosterone causes the penis to grow in size, it could also cause the clitoris to grow in size. So basically you could have, this increased hyperactivity of these secondary sexual characteristics. So you'll also sometimes, when we talk about inhibition and some of the factors that drive these, remember if you're putting out too much hormone, then it's going to go back and inhibit whatever's telling it. So remember, ACTH is going to trigger the adrenal cortex, and then the adrenal cortex is putting out these androgens. So what they're saying is if your androgens are really high, it goes back and it tells your anterior pituitary, stop sending that signal. So it can cause other issues because remember, ACTH tells several things what to do, right? Aldosterone, cortisol, and then the gonadocorticoids. So it would cause problems with aldosterone and cortisol excretion. Now we move on to the adrenal medulla. So this is the middle section of the adrenal gland. And the adrenal medulla releases epinephrine and norepinephrine, and this group is called catecholamines. So just like we had mineralocorticoid, aldosterone was the one we focused on, the overall term is catecholamine, and we're looking at these two hormones, epinephrine and norepinephrine. So you can see that they do several activities, right? We can see it's an increase in blood glucose. We have vasoconstriction, so the smooth muscle in the blood vessels is constricting, causing increased blood pressure. We're going to see increased heart rate. And we're going to see that blood is being diverted to the brain, the heart, and the skeletal muscles. We'll talk a little bit more about capillaries and how that can happen in the next unit. If you look at the bottom two bullet points, I'm telling you specifically that epinephrine targets bronchial dilation. Someone has asthma, their bronchioles are kind of collapsing, and so we hit them with an EpiPen, right? That's going to cause the bronchioles, the tubes in the lungs, to dilate, and that allows more air in. And so hopefully if we're seeing bronchial dilation, we're thinking oxygen, maybe. And if we have more oxygen able to get into the blood, we're able to do cellular respiration and we're able to generate more ATP, right? So epinephrine, increased metabolic activities. Metabolic activities, you should be thinking something about glucose, right? Increased oxygen, those are the first two, or the two players that we need to generate the most ATP, right? And then the blood flow to the skeletal muscles and the heart. The norepinephrine really influences the smooth muscle of the blood vessels. So that's going to cause vasoconstriction and it's going to cause an increase in blood pressure. This slide, I wanted us to see that there's two mechanisms here if you're under stress. There's a short-term stress response and there's a long-term. You can see the short-term stress response is your sympathetic nervous system, right? So the sympathetic nervous system is going to be triggered to cause the adrenal medulla to release epinephrine and norepinephrine. So if I asked you, what's the trigger, what's the stimulus trigger for epinephrine to be released, you're going to tell me sympathetic nervous system and stress. Fight or flight, hopefully that's what you're thinking, and stress. Usually you're under stress if you're doing fight or flight, all right? Okay. So the adrenal medulla is going to release catecholamines. This is short-term, instant, right? You're going to have increased heart rate, increased blood pressure. You're going to see that the liver is going to start dumping glucose into the bloodstream. You're going to see the dilation of the bronchioles. You're going to see a change in blood flow, right? We said diverted to the brain, the heart, and the skeletal muscles so you can run away. Increased metabolic rate. On the more prolonged or long-term stress, you can see we go kind of the pathway we've been talking about where the hypothalamus releases CRH. That goes to the anterior pituitary, tells it to release ACTH. ACTH goes to the adrenal cortex, and it's going to cause the release of two hormones, aldosterone and cortisol. So hopefully we see mineralocorticoid, and we're thinking aldosterone, and we see glucocorticoid, and we're thinking cortisol. So the aldosterone is going to cause increased absorption of sodium, increased absorption of water. So increased sodium, increased water, that increases blood volume, which then increases blood pressure. For the glucocorticoid, remember cortisol has something to do with glucose. So we're going to see glucose broken down. We're going to see an increase in fats and proteins being converted, that gluconeogenesis, and we're going to see a suppression of the immune system. So in anatomy, if you see two mechanisms that are kind of doing the same thing, it should tell you that that thing is pretty important. So if we're under a lot of stress, whether it's mental or physical, we're going to increase our heart rate, our blood pressure. We're going to make sure we have tons of glucose available. We're going to increase metabolism. So hopefully this makes a little bit of sense. Hypersecretion, I just wanted to mention this because if somebody doesn't have an issue with the actual hormone, right? So you're making cortisol just fine, you're making aldosterone just fine. For some reason, you're releasing tons of epinephrine and norepinephrine from your adrenal medulla. You're not under a lot of stress, nobody's attacking you, your sympathetic nervous system is just firing all the time. So uncontrolled sympathetic nervous system, this could be what they call an autonomic nervous system disorder. So if you constantly have epinephrine and norepinephrine released, you're going to have high amounts of glucose in your bloodstream. You're going to have your cells speeding up metabolism. You're going to have increased heart rate, right? You're going to have increased blood pressure. So this can cause a problem for people, right? If you imagine if your heart's just beating rapidly all the time and your blood pressure is high all the time, that's going to cause effects on other organs in the body. We finally get to move to the pancreas. Remember, this is our the one so far, the one endocrine gland that has both an exocrine and an endocrine function. So exocrine, the pancreas is going to release digestive enzymes. And we won't talk about this again until we get to digestion in Unit 4. The pancreas does have an endocrine function. It releases these two hormones, glucagon and insulin. You can see here the pancreas, and the pancreas has pancreatic ducts that are going to dump those digestive juices right into the duodenum of the small intestine. So to help you break down your food source into individual molecules that can be absorbed in your bloodstream, the pancreas, the majority of it, is going to supply those digestive enzymes. A few of the cells, and these pancreatic isolates, these lighter pink cells here, are going to do the endocrine function. So they're going to release both insulin and glucagon. So the stimulus trigger for insulin to be released is high blood glucose. So if your blood glucose levels are high, insulin is going to be stimulated to be released from the pancreas. The insulin is going to bind to receptors. It's going to cause blood glucose to be removed. or to cause glucose to be removed from the blood. Maybe that's a better way. We're going to store it as glycogen. So basically, if you have one glucose and another glucose, and you want to take that and turn it into glycogen and store glycogen in your liver, what is responsible for that? Insulin. So insulin can also tell adipose cells to decrease the amount of fats that are put into the blood and to store fat. So all of your body cells are going to have insulin receptors. So the stimulus trigger for insulin to be released is high blood glucose. Insulin is going to be released from the pancreas. It's going to target the liver, and you can say all body cells. So if your glucose is too high, we're going to tell your liver to store it. We're going to tell your body cells to take up glucose and store glucose. On the clinical slide, I really just want to focus on the hyposecretion here. These two terms will come up, type 1 diabetes, type 2. They used to call type 1 the juvenile diabetes. I usually think of this, and this is not 100% true, but genetic. You're born with this issue of hypo or low insulin. Type 2 used to be called adult onset diabetes. I don't know if they call it that anymore, but basically your insulin isn't triggering the response that it used to. So sometimes people think of type 2 as maybe someone that's overweight. You can control sometimes type 2 diabetes by the amount of food that's consumed, exercising, that kind of thing. So it's basically something to do with the amount of insulin and the receptors. It doesn't mean that you're not making insulin. Where somebody that has type 1 diabetes, there's something wrong with their cells and they're not secreting insulin or not enough insulin. So you might hear those terms in the future. So what do we do? If somebody has a hyposecretion of insulin, we can give them insulin, right? You can inject insulin. And hypersecretion is if you have too much insulin. So this is why people that have issues with insulin, if they don't make enough insulin, if they're taking or administering insulin themselves, they have to kind of stay in between this, right? They don't want to have hypo and they don't want to have hyper. So having too much insulin is not good either because your blood sugar drops. So you have low blood glucose. Your brain is kind of confused. It's dizzy. Remember, your brain wants lots of glucose. And so if you don't have enough, it's almost like your brain is starving, right? It's going to cause you to want to eat a lot. It's going to make you dizzy and confused. So people that are taking insulin have to constantly monitor because they want to be somewhere between the hypo and the hyper. This is kind of like Goldilocks, right? Too little's no good, too much is no good. You want the just right. Glucagon is the antagonistic hormone. So the stimulus trigger for glucagon is low blood glucose. So if your blood glucose levels drop too low, your pancreas is going to release glucagon. And glucagon is going to release glucose. So I'm going to do it up here. Glycogen. Glucagon is going to tell the liver to take glycogen and break it down into individual glucoses. And we're going to dump that glucose into the bloodstream. We're going to do glycogenolysis, glycogen breakdown. We're going to create glucose from non-carbohydrate sources. We're going to stop storing glucose. The major target, what we're going to focus on for glucagon, is the liver. So what's the stimulus trigger? Low blood glucose levels. Where's glucagon released from? The pancreas. Where does glucagon go? Liver. What does it do when it gets there? Breaks glycogen down into individual glucoses and releases them into the blood. The pineal gland or pineal gland, remember this is on the posterior side in that epithalamus region of the diencephalon or middle part of the brain. It's going to secrete melatonin. If you have high melatonin, it's going to cause drowsiness, and it's going to regulate your sleep and awake cycles. That's the circadian rhythm. So melatonin, it's a little weird. The stimulus, it's kind of a brain, it stays within the brain, right? So what's the stimulus trigger for melatonin? So I usually say darkness. I couldn't get that out with this pen. So the stimulus for melatonin, darkness, also your brain, your hypothalamus. It stimulates the pineal gland to release melatonin. And where does it go? It goes back to the brain. So basically this hormone is released from the brain and then goes back and tells the brain, okay, shut down, it's time for bed. Parathyroid, this works, it's next to the thyroid, right? This parathyroid hormone does the opposite. It's another antagonistic hormone, this time to calcitonin. So we already talked about calcitonin being released from the parafollicular cells of the thyroid. Now we're talking about the parathyroid glands. Remember, these are small structures that are on the posterior surface of the thyroid. Usually you have 4, you can have as few as 2, you can have more than, you can have 6. Sometimes they can migrate. These kind of have a mind of their own, right? So this parathyroid hormone is going to be released from the parathyroid gland if your blood calcium levels are low. So in this case, you're going to see the stimulus trigger is low blood calcium levels. So if your blood calcium levels are low, it's going to cause the parathyroid gland to release the parathyroid hormone. And you're going to see 3 targets here. So the target organs: bones, kidneys, intestines. Basically, you're telling your bones, I want you to break down bone and release calcium. So bone breakdown, release calcium. Kidneys, save all calcium. Intestines, absorb all calcium. So there are 3 target organs here. That should tell you that this is pretty important. Remember, if you have low blood calcium levels, that means no muscle contraction or not efficient, no nerve transmission. We haven't talked about it yet, but you also need calcium for clotting. So if you have any tears, any micro tears in blood vessels, you're not going to be able to do clotting without calcium. So very important that your calcium level stays normal. If you have low blood calcium, parathyroid hormone is going to be released, and it's going to target your bones and your kidneys and your intestines, and basically have everybody saving every drop of calcium that it can and dumping it into the bloodstream. I went through and just highlighted kind of the hormones that we're going to talk about from these other tissue types. So remember, we talked about true endocrine organs, and then we talked about other tissue that's going to secrete a hormone that could be considered an endocrine hormone, right? So when we talk about the heart, we're going to talk about atrial natriuretic peptide. When we talk about the kidneys, we're going to come back and talk about erythropoietin. When we talk about the liver and digestion, we'll talk about angiotensin. So we'll also talk about that when we talk about blood pressure. So just kind of giving you an idea of some of the things that we're going to talk about again. Realize they are hormones that are going to direct action or go to target organs and direct an action. Last slide, pointing out 2 factors. One, is it possible that some sort of environmental pollutant could get in the way of this hormone message or this hormone cascade, right? So just looking at the adrenal gland, we said the corticotropic releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, right? And that tells the anterior pituitary to release ACTH. And then ACTH has to travel to the adrenal cortex. And then we have those 5 hormones that are released. Is it possible that some chemical pollutant could bind to a target organ and stop the release of certain hormones? And the answer is yes. If it's a chemical, it could bind to a chemical receptor, right? If it mimics the hormone enough. The second part of this slide is just to point out that as you age, everything starts to kind of decline. So you're going to see growth hormone levels decline. You're going to see thyroid hormones. So you're going to have lower metabolic rates. Muscles are going to atrophy. You're going to see significant changes with the ovaries in females as they age. Males, not so much. Testosterone doesn't really diminish too much. It does some, but not really to the effect that estrogen diminishes in females. So we'll kind of come back and talk about these. Every PowerPoint chapter concludes with kind of this slide that everything kind of goes downhill. So I'm not trying to downplay getting old or make it sound, terrible, just to let you know that all of these hormone levels kind of slowly start diminishing as you age. Hopefully you enjoyed this chapter as much as I did. I know it's a lot. I know they say things like don't memorize, but the only way to start this is to memorize. That's why I have you fill out the chart. I would kind of go through the chart till you can kind of rattle off all of these. You can follow the flow, right? You can say hypothalamus releases corticotropin releasing hormone, goes to the anterior pituitary, releases adrenocorticotropic hormone or ACTH. That goes to the adrenal cortex, binds, and causes the release of aldosterone, cortisol. And then androgens, which make testosterone, estrogen, progesterone. So if you get that part down, then you can start kind of thinking about the critical thinking. What happens if there's too much? What happens if there's not enough? So for each of the hormones, I would first start by just knowing the pathway, maybe writing the pathway out, and then you can look at what happens if you have too much or too little. So hopefully that helped, and I'll talk to you guys later. Bye.